Hi folks, Adam Johnston here to talk about the Geometallurgical Induction guide that's going to be part of Cancha moving forward. Basically, this is a guide on how to get alignment between geology and metallurgy at the start of a Geomet program. It's no secret that geologists and metallurgists often have difficulty communicating, and yet it comes as a surprise to people that metallurgists don't often understand most of the concepts in geology when they're told them. They don't understand the vocabulary and what terms they're using, and vice versa, right? So it's really important to have this meeting between the geologists and metallurgists. It's not good enough just to give them the reports and things like that. You really need to explain it to them and explain terms in those in the geological discussion. So the geologist needs to tell the story of the deposit, and the metallurgist needs to explain the fundamentals for the process, what things in the geology he thinks that might affect the process. But both sides, both parties should interrupt continuously. On one famous course that I gave, we were into day 3 where I'd been asking the geologists to explain themselves for every term that they offered during the week. And they'd been giving excellent explanations. And then on like the 3rd day, the geologist said, hey, I'm giving all this background on geology, but when somebody can explain to me what flotation is? So that was pretty humbling, and I realized straight away that, it goes both ways. So really, don't be surprised if somebody works on a copper mine for 10 years as a geologist and has no idea what flotation is. In the same way, please don't think that a metallurgist understands what the difference between a volcanic and a skarn are, or something like that, or even how they come about. It's not part of a day-to-day job usually. This is why there's so much trouble communicating. So we really need to talk to each other like we're 5-year-olds, being empathetic and having a lot of courtesy to explain terms to the layman. The idea is we need to build a shared understanding, and if we don't explain things to each other and we don't have that good understanding, then we're not going to really be able to understand how to predict the recovery, the throughput, or the product quality through the Geomet. Neither the geologist nor the metallurgist can do it alone. It needs to be a shared effort. So, when the geologists give their talk straight away, geologists are often asked to talk about exploration upside. They're usually asked to getting audited continuously, and so they're always talking about QA and what the category of the resources or reserves are. And that's just not interesting for this Geomet discussion. Let's just work on the understanding that the deposit on the table is what's being studied. And if more metal is found in the future, that's fantastic, but we're not going to be doing test work on stuff we don't know what it is. And the QA reports, we just believe you. We believe that the numbers that you're presenting are correct. We're not here to audit your geology. We're here to understand what you know about the deposit. So the first thing, starting out, from a regional level, the geologist should explain what kind of deposit it is, where it is, and what other mines or deposits are nearby. Obviously, sometimes there can be explanation that, even within the same mine, you can have 2 veins which are really quite different. So that has to be explained. Is it similar or is it different to other deposits in the area? And if so, how? And even compare the deposit type to something on the other side of the earth. If you're working on a Mississippi Valley zinc project in Peru, explain what Mississippi Valley means and how how that kind of deposit comes about. Don't assume that the metallurgists are going to understand what that means. So the first thing to discuss is the deposit genesis. Usually that comes with some sort of fluids and chemistry and temperature and pressure, and those things have a profound effect on the chemistry of the mineralization and also the grain size. Now the size of the crystals that are formed during mineralization are super important for metallurgists. Usually it's one of the most important things to determine the liberation characteristics of the material, of the economic minerals. And so if you've got a hot deposit where it's pervasive and the whole thing was, magma when it formed, then you're going to get, quite big crystals, and it'll be easy to liberate. Whereas if you've got a supergene where if the solution came down from above and precipitated from a cold solution, then we're going to see much harder textures to liberate, much more complicated mineralogy, and less pervasive, less existence of single large crystals, and more sort of complex textures. Also, multiple mineralization events are super common. So, discuss what events happened prior to mineralization, so how the host rock formed, and what it was like, when the actual first mineralization event came in, what was going on, and if there'd been multiple events, discuss it, and if they can't be separated, and if they're overprinting each other and it's complex, just say that. But if you do know, for example, that there's post-mineralization dikes or post-mineralization pyrite events that came in and things like that, that's going to be important for you to discuss that and explain that carefully to the metallurgist so that they understand what that means. Host rock, so I already mentioned that, we need to understand what the rock was like before the mineralization, and then what other things happen after. Sometimes we've had databases with more than 45 lithologies, and that's completely hopeless for geometallurgy. There's just not enough sample. We can't get enough samples, and it's very difficult to get homogeneous samples of each individual lithology if it's broken down into so many categories. Hopefully we're trying to get 20 to 30 samples as a minimum per domain. And if we're talking about host rock domains, so say we've got 6 lithologies and they're all mineralized, then can you imagine having 6 times 30 is going to be 180 samples, which is a pretty big program. So then taking that to 45, we're talking about several, getting into the thousands of samples, and it'd be very difficult to get the samples and very costly to process them and very difficult to interpret them. So, and also, it's not going to be useful for operations. It's not going to be practical for a block model to have so many rock types, in order to get them into a regularized block model, and have something practical that the miners can use to optimize the mine plan and to predict the production. We need to have a smaller number. So they'll have to be grouped together. You might have 15 different kinds of diorite. Are any of them substantially different? Often when the geologists are drilling the rock, they'll know if one particular ore type has, or rock type I should say, has higher hardness or different physical properties for crushing and grinding, or different mineralization styles and things like that. So try to separate the ones that are important. We don't want to group together things that are not similar, but at the same time, we do have to try to get down to a smaller number of lithological types. A great way to do that, by the way, is to visit the core shack and look at them together, right? So primary mineralogy, discuss that, what minerals are there for in the host rock, and obviously in the mineralization, and what alteration types, intensities are there, and what do they look like. Structural controls, so if you've got veins or faults and things like that, just take a bit of time to explain where they are, and really take time to discuss how they are spatially, because obviously Geomet, we're really looking at how do we sample this material, and then when it goes into a production plan, how do we deal with this in a block model and whatnot. And we need to understand how these structural controls are in order to define domains and whatnot. Primary ore characteristics, so what are the economic minerals, and the important thing there is a grain size distribution and the mineral associations, liberation characteristics, and that might not always be able to be possible for the geologist to be able to see that sort of stuff with optically when they're logging the core. So they may be aware that certain minerals are present, but they may never have seen it with their own eye. You know, classic one would be PGMs or gold and things like that, where, you know, we know from assays that those metals are present, but nobody's ever seen them with the bare eye. But certainly with base metals and other things like that, you know, there should be able to be discussion about these things. And if it is PGMs and gold and whatnot, then discuss the pyrite, sulfides. You know, 90% of the time it's the sulfides, right? 90% of the time it's the iron sulfides and the metal sulfides, which are the minerals of most interest. Obviously, there's oxide deposits, and so you can understand that. But the most of the world's geomet is done on sulfides and oxides. Gangue mineralogy. So, you know, there could be all kinds of fantastic information about the difference between feldspar and plagioclase. Those two minerals usually don't matter at all to Geomet. They exist in the rock, but they're not hosting the metal, and you know, usually they don't have the biggest difference between them on comminution and rock breakage and grinding. So you know, the pervasive content of pyroxene or olivine and things like this can find its way into geomet models, but usually the things that are more important are the clays. Now, saying that you've got clay, if it's just, you know, less than 0.1% or something like that, you know, where somebody might have seen some staining on the rock, or there might be some sort of you know, a few grains that people have seen in a meter of core, that's really not going to cause a big problem. What we're talking about here is, you know, things like porphyroid, siderite, cerussite, montmorillonite, kaolinite, obviously. These sort of clay minerals are super important because they can cause all kinds of problems for materials handling, for crushing and grinding, and also for things like flotation and leaching with viscosity, filtration and thickening. So clays have a big impact on most metallurgical processes, and they can be a challenge. So make sure that you discuss how strong the clay content is and what kind of clays are there. Problematic materials also include, you know, quartz, because it tends to encapsulate and it's very hard and abrasive. Pyrite tends to be an interfering nuisance. So does pyrrhotite, which is even worse in flotation. Pyrrhotite will also change the slurry chemistry in the plant, and so special attention has to be paid to that one. And carbon in its different forms, you know, it can, if it's oily, then it can affect the reagents and the froth in a flotation circuit. If it's in a graphitic or organic form, then it can cause problems with preg rubbing and gold extraction. So lots of problems with carbon. Make sure you understand that. Talc tends to self-float, and so it's a big dilutant for flotation concentrates. Fibrous material, big problem for health and safety, and also has some issues in Geomet as well, as far as testing on grinding and whatnot. So any kind of asbestos or anything like that needs to be identified, and certainly any water-soluble metals. That might not be super obvious to the geologists. They, you know, may not be checking the water for grade, but the if there is a risk of water-soluble metal content, then that's going to be really important for the metallurgist to know about that. Textural analysis, I already talked about, you know, the grains, but we need to talk about macro textures. So on a larger scale, you know, do we have everything formed into stockwork where all the sulfides are in narrow veins through the rock, or do we have dissemination? On the micro textures, which is actually on the grain level, You know, do we have rimming of chalcocite over pyrite, or do we have intergrowth of chalcopyrite within the sphalerite, for example? These are going to have a big impact on liberation. And like I say, the microtextures might not be something that the geologists already know about, but it is something that would need to be discussed. And again, the temperatures and the way that the deposit was formed can be an indicator whether there might be something going on there. Secondary processes such as, you know, weathering, like number one Geomet thing is weathering, right? I mean, the difference between oxide and sulfide and the transition from oxide to sulfide is by far the thing which causes the most grief in processing. So we really need to know how we're going to map that boundary. How clear is it? Is it a transition, or is it literally a change from one inch to the next? And people talk sometimes about transition zones, but when you actually look at the rock, it might actually be mixed. So what do I mean by that? I mean that along the fractures, there might be oxides, but within the rock, it might be perfect sulfides. So what you might see is that there might be absolutely perfect sulfides present at the same time with absolutely fantastic oxides in exactly the same cubic meter of rock. If that's the case, I like to call it mixed, because we have mixed oxide and sulfide. Whereas in other cases, what you've got is a transition. You know, it's the entire rock itself has been oxidized, but the oxidation isn't complete. And so you've got materials that are semi-oxidized, tarnished, things like that. And that's going to be a lot harder to deal with in flotation, for example, a lot harder to classify, and it's going to be harder to get a good Geomet program classification if you don't understand whether it's mixed or transition. So that you can check that by looking at photos or looking at the drill core itself. That's definitely the best way to understand what the transition is. Definitely you need to look at photos. Definitely, you know, if you can, get to the core shack and look at the transition area between oxide and sulfide. Always start at the top of the hole and work your way down an entire hole right to the bottom to really understand how the profile changes, paying attention to those transitions and boundaries between ore types. Alteration patterns. So, you know, obviously there's a sequence of alteration, and, you know, there's lots of great diagrams that the geologists might be able to show as to what kinds of alterations will happen at different parts of the deposit. I think the important thing for the metallurgist is to understand how these alterations are distributed spatially throughout the deposit. And the most important thing is that we're not using alterations. So the geologists use the alterations in order to give them an indicator as to where there might be more ore. Okay, so they're using alterations to try to find more metal outside of the area they've already got it located. The metallurgists are interested in different alterations for a different purpose. Alterations can often cause clay formation. I've already just mentioned that, you know, clays are super important. It can cause hardness issues. We can see different comminution profiles, so, you know, different competency for breakage and for grinding, and also for the alterations can have an effect on things like leaching and flotation. But not all alterations do. You know, for example, chloritic alteration can be very strong without having a big effect on things. Potassic, not necessarily the worst thing in the world. But argillic, absolutely awful. You know, if you've got a strong argillic alteration, then that's going to cause you all kinds of grief because it's forming clays, right? So the important thing is to say, okay, what are the alterations that we've got? Which ones do we think are important? And then the second question is, what intensity are they important? So I already mentioned that, you know, in a meter of core, you might have, you know, the dominant alteration might be chloritic. It might be 30%. Okay, so the geologist might put in their logs that this is a chloritic alteration, but in the same core, there might be 10% argillic. So we might have like 5% kaolinite in the rock, which would be a big important issue for the metallurgist. but because it wasn't the dominant one, it wasn't logged as being the dominant alteration. So this is where you start to see the deviation between what the geologists need and what the metallurgists need in the logging of alterations. So it's important to discuss it. Hopefully, the best practice is that the geologists would log the intensity of each of the alterations, not just noting which is the most important one, but which is the most pervasive one in the section that's being logged. But if people log each of the alterations and the intensity, then you might say, okay, I'm just not interested in chloritic. But if I've got more than a 2, usually there's a scale like 0, trace, 1, 2, and 3, or something like that in the alterations. So say 2 and more might be the problem there for a certain alteration. So kind of establishing what threshold you've got, and then talking about where that is in the deposit, and that can often reduce a great big halo down to just some specific areas that can be studied further. Geological domains. So the geologists are using domains to do their grade estimation, so things like kriging and whatnot. So there's already usually geological domains that have been identified, usually based around grade and rock type. They often coincide with the domains that are most useful for Geomet. So I know that sometimes we spend millions of dollars on test work and thousands of hours on analysis, and then finally, what do we come up with? We come up with using the same domains as the geologists were using. And I know that sometimes people are super disappointed by that. Hey, it's just one mountain, and the geologists know what they're doing. They know how the rocks are distributed and what the different rock types are. If it's different geologically, it only makes sense that it would be different metallurgically, in general. Okay, so talk about the geological domains and where the transitions and boundaries are and spatial continuity of them. They might be useful for Geomet as well, and quite often are. So then the metallurgists can give a description about what they think about the metallurgy for the project. This would depend on how far advanced they are, but if they're going to be looking at leaching or upgrading through gravity separation, or if they're going to be upgrading through flotation and things like this, they'll need to be discussed. The metallurgists might start to discuss about minor elements, which could be a problem commercially for concentrates. So the geologists may not have been paying a lot of attention to cadmium or bismuth to copper ratios, or one deposit I was on, they were ready to put out a PEA, and we only just discovered it was full of arsenic. So the arsenic hadn't been discussed because copper was a pay metal. So we need to discuss about those sort of things, about the deposit and the variability. What we're not here to discuss is equipment selection, and not really to discuss the test work design. So, it's interesting between us metallurgists, if we're going to use a, HPGR or a SAG mill, really not that interesting for this discussion that we're having just now. And the same for test work design. You don't really need to discuss the reagents that you're planning on using, or, what kinds of comminution tests you're going to be running. Really is just focusing on just the fundamentals of these processes, and how the mineralogy can affect them. So, the principal features, just as a reminder, the list of parameters that geometallurgists use that are going to most affect the metallurgical results. So for each result, there may be a different list of principal features. For comminution, it might be usually the lithological type, because it's a massive part of the rock, and that's most of what you're going to be grinding. Whereas, for example, flotation might be more focused on the sulfide mineralogy, or the metal, the economic mineral chemistry, mineralogical textures. So different features for to be used. So feature is just basically a column of knowledge in the logging. So, the lithology might be one, the intensity of geological alteration might be another, the gold grade might be another. So oftentimes between all the logs, geotech, assays, we might end up with a few hundred possible features that we could use in order to predict the metallurgy in the geometallurgical program. The principal features are the ones that we actually think are important. There's usually a much shorter list, maybe somewhere between 3 to 5 or something like that. Features are going to be the most important ones that are driving the process. So we need to brainstorm that, and everybody sort of discuss about what they think the list might be. Usually head grade of the economic minerals is an economic element, so usually ones that you put up straight away. Lithology and alteration usually get on the list pretty soon. But then you can start talking about other things like, RQD or, clay content or, pyrrhotite grade and things like that. So you really need to brainstorm it. It's always different on every deposit. And you can brainstorm, what the domains might be and how we might go about putting together composites for test work based on those domains. So critical processing factors, already mentioned liberation several times in this discussion, and it is super important. But discuss other things that might impact recovery. Copper content of a gold ore might be really important. And, often in a discussion where people say, no, but we've only got a few hundred ppm of copper, that can't be important. Yeah, if you've got 1 gram per ton of gold and 200 grams per ton of copper, you're going to be leaching 200 times more copper than gold. So it really is important. So don't let people's misperceptions continue in this discussion. You need, if you know that you're worried about copper grade as a metallurgist on the project, don't let the geologist talk you down. And at the same time, the metallurgist might not understand what the geologist is saying, so the geologist really needs to keep on at it until the metallurgist understands if they've got a concern about something geologically. But basically, I just discussed the principal features that we've already defined, and think about what things in the processing, whether it's materials handling, SG differences, gravity, density of the rocks, particle sizes and rock sizes, viscosity, clays, all these things. Talk about how they might affect the different stages of your process, and see how that can be mapped. Spatial variability. So, oftentimes that things might not already be mapped. So the geologists may not have mapped things that we find are important during this discussion. So now will be the time to say, okay, what do we need to do in order to get these things mapped into the block model, or even logged onto the core. Sometimes the color of the rock isn't logged, and there's no better indication for Geomet than the color of the rock. So supporting data, wrapping this up, there needs to be a transfer of data from the geologist to the metallurgist. That would usually be the drill hole database. That would include the logging, geochemistry, geotech, photos, mineralization, all the other stuff that's in there. Don't hold back, just give the entire database. When it comes to the photos, just get access to the photos. Sometimes there can be petabytes of data and photos, but often try to pick a couple of emblematic holes, ones that go right through all the different major domains and whatnot, and maybe get those photos to the metallurgists and the geometallurgical team. If there is already a block model, hand it over. But for both the drilling and the block model, the Geomet team's going to need to have like a full glossary of the codes and the legends. So for whatever reason, people often are using terms like 306, 318, 319 for different lithologies. So just getting that list of numbers in the database isn't going to help. You're going to need to have the index as to what each of those codes mean. And oftentimes in the drilling, there might be several columns for things like gold grade, for example. There might have been 5 different methods and a few different interpretations of those. And sometimes they leave them all in there in the database. So there really need to be an explanation there as to which columns you should be using. Visual materials, already mentioned the photos, cross sections and photo micrographs. Basically, the one that I will mention at the end here is the sample library. So in any core shack, in order to train geologists coming in, they're going to do logging. There's usually some sort of set of example rocks for all the different rock types that are there in the deposit. So oftentimes they're labeled. They might have really fantastic looking rocks there with well labeled. Sometimes those are in digital form. They might be in a PowerPoint or in a PDF. Sometimes a poster on the wall. Sometimes a suite of rocks on the bench. Whatever form it's in, we need to get the Geomet and the metallurgical team to be able to see these and to go through them one by one. And if you can get a library to give to the Geomet and metallurgical team to put in the MATLAB or to put in the office, that would be fantastic. If not, like I say, PowerPoints and PDFs are fantastic too. But it is super important to have those photos of all the different ones. Nothing better than an image to let people know what's going on. After this discussion, one of the first things that people are going to have to do is take metallurgical samples. And so now will be a good time to discuss what drilling has been done, what kind of drilling was it? Was it RC or was it diamond drilling? And explain to the metallurgist what that means. Where is the core physically? Is it on site or is it in a store somewhere? The metallurgists can talk about what size particles they need, because some metallurgical tests require big rocks. They require 3-4 inch particles. Other tests can get away with 1/2 inch particles, and some of them can get away with assay rejects. So there's nothing cheaper than using the assay rejects for metallurgical testing. By using the assay rejects, you're preserving the core and you're getting advantage of all that material. And the other cool thing is that you actually already have an assay for it, so you know exactly what's in the bag. The downside, of course, is that it can be oxidized. It can be contaminated. Sometimes the assay rejects aren't treated as well as other materials. So you need to have that discussion as to what state it's in, where it is. But the assay reject material is fantastic for metallurgy in some cases. Need to discuss previous sampling. So, nothing more depressing than going through all the exercise of choosing metallurgical samples and then somebody goes to the core tray and it's empty. So hopefully there's a log of how much core is left in the trays. And then talk about logistics. So usually the geologists are, have technicians and helpers and infrastructure where the core is, and the metallurgists don't. And so in order to get those samples chosen, can be done by the team. But when it comes to actually extracting the samples and cutting them and putting them in bags and getting them transported to the laboratory, usually the geological team is much better equipped for that. So that needs to be discussed. I think I already discussed this, but what are the processing implications? Think about all the different processes. Don't just think about recovery, whether it be leaching or flotation. Think also about materials handling and crushing, grinding, tailing storage, all that stuff. Risk assessment. So I think basically by going through this, you're already discussing the risks the whole time. But the important thing would be to discuss at the end. Okay, what gaps do we have in the data? What data has to be collected? What are we missing here? And what work needs to be done in order to fill those gaps. So the follow-up actions would be, first of all, to establish regular meetings. So, everyone's going to cringe if you say every week, sometimes every 2 weeks. I certainly wouldn't do it less often than every 2 weeks, even if it's just a quick meeting. in those meetings, you need to track how people are going at getting that additional data that's been requested, whether the samples have been chosen and whether they've been extracted, how the test work is going, you know, what's the advance on the test work, what's the learnings, and then just monitoring in general, what are the strategies that you're doing in order to get to those predictions at the end of the day, and have an action plan, you know, put dates on stuff, make people responsible. And of course, you know, the next follow-up action would always be to loading everything up into Cancha, which would be the easiest way for you to choose your samples and to track the data as it comes in from the laboratory and make those predictions at the end of the day. Okay, so thanks. And this is going to be a PDF that'll be in the tools menu of Cancha. So, you know, this is something that you'll be able to put up and work through on each project. Hopefully find it useful. Looking forward to hearing the feedback. Thanks.